This slideshow is for 1.4 multiplying integers. When we're multiplying integers, the rules are very simple. If the two numbers that we are multiplying have the same sign, the answer is always positive. The multiplication doesn't change. If the two numbers that we're multiplying have different signs, then the answer is always going to be a negative. On this next chart here, we're going to see this kind of laid out. If the first number is positive times another positive, our answer is going to be positive. If the first number is negative times a second number that's negative, our answer is going to be positive, because we always get a positive answer if the numbers have the same sign. If I have a positive times a negative, my answer will be negative. Just like if I have a negative times a positive, my answer will be negative. Because if I'm multiplying numbers with different signs, my answer is always negative. Easy peasy, right? Shouldn't be any questions. Let's go ahead and look at some examples. And remember, the math doesn't change here. It's all about the signs. Okay, example 1 is pretty straightforward. Find negative 5 times negative 6. The math, the actual multiplication never changes. 5 times 6 is still 30. And then we just look at the signs at the end. Negative times a negative, since the signs are the same, the answer is positive. So the answer is positive 30. In example 2, we have two ways to show multiplication here. When we see a number next to another number in parentheses, that means multiplication. So here again, the multiplication doesn't change, the ones that you learned in 3rd and 4th grade. 3 times 4 is 12, and then a positive times a negative is a negative. So the answer here is negative 12. In this problem here, 7 times 4 is and always will be 28, and then a negative times a positive is a negative. So the answer here is negative 28. Okay. Let me flip back here. So that was example 1 and 2, very basic. We're going to start with example 1. Here's example 3. Basic dividing integers with the same sign. So example 1 is going to be negative 8. Okay, in example 3, we have 3 different examples. They all look similar, but they are all actually different. They all include exponents, which we learned in the last section meant that you take this number and you multiply it by itself this many times. So you take the exponent tells you how many times to use the base. Now these parentheses here are important because if you look between A and B, A has parentheses and B doesn't. So what that means is this whole thing, the negative 2, is your base raised to the second power. So that means it's negative 2 to the second power is equal to negative 2 times negative 2. So 2 times 2 is 4, and then a negative times a negative is a positive. So the answer here is 4. This is different from this example where it says evaluate negative 5 squared because the parentheses are missing, which means that this exponent is only attached to the 5, not the negative symbol. So this is actually saying, give me the negative or the opposite answer to 5 times 5. And 5 times 5 is a positive times a positive, which is 25, and then the negative answer of that, which would be negative 25. And this one is very similar to the one A. The whole base is negative 4 raised to the third power. The thing about it is we can see that it means to multiply this negative 4 times itself 3 times, but we take it 2 at a time. So this negative times a negative is a positive. So this is positive 16 times a negative 4. And that means that the positive times the negative is going to give you a negative answer of 64. So really what stands out here are the parentheses that are around the base and what happens when you're multiplying more than 2 integers. Okay, and then we have one more example here, and we'll try some problems together. Okay, this bar graph here shows the number of taxis a company has in service. You can see that as the years go on, the number of taxis goes down, and every line represents 50 fewer taxis. Excuse me. The number of taxis decreases by the same amount each year for 4 years. Find the total change in the number of taxis. Well, we already said it, but the bar graph shows the number of taxis in service decreases by 50 each year. So it's telling us to use a model to solve the problem. To find the total change, we take the change per year and we multiply it by the number of years. Well, we know that the number of years that this is happening is 4, and the change per year, by looking at this chart, we can see that every year it goes down by the same amount, which they tell us is 50 fewer taxis. So to get the total change, it's negative 50 times 4. And the reason it's negative 50 because the number decreases each year. And then we apply our integer rules for multiplication, and a negative times a positive is a negative, and 50 times 4 is 200. So the answer is negative 200, which means the total change in the number of taxis is negative 200 in 4 years. Okay, this bar graph here. Sorry. Okay, so back to our display here. All right, so we're going to take a second every time I come up with a slide, and I want you to jot down your answer, and the next slide will tell you if you're correct. 12 times a negative 2. Write down your answer. You should have gotten a negative 24, positive times a negative. Parentheses, negative 3, close parentheses, raised to the second power. Just as we saw in the example, that means that it's this entire base that's raised to the second power. So a negative times a negative is a positive, and that we get 3 times 3 is 9. In this problem here, we see the exponent is only attached to the 7. So it's the same thing as saying a negative, or the opposite to 7 times 7, which is 49, and then they want the negative answer. And here we have some information about a manatee. Those are like seals. The population decreases by 15 manatees each year for 3 years. Find the total change in the manatee population. Well, we know that it decreases by 15 for every 3 years. So we learned from our example that for total change, you're going to multiply that, and a negative times a positive gives me a negative 45, which means the manatee population decreases by 45 manatees.